Hello and welcome to Tattva-Deep, Conversations and Explorations. For our fifth episode on biology, we sat down with Professor John Wilkins. Professor Wilkins has a PhD from the University of Melbourne. He worked at the University of Queensland, Australia, before taking up an ARC Research Fellowship at the University of Sydney, followed by lecturing at Bond, UNSW and Melbourne. He's presently a subject coordinator at the University of Melbourne and a research scholar at the Ronin Institute, headquartered in Montclair, USA, and has authored and co-edited several books, among them Defining Species, Species, A History of the Idea, Species, The Evolution of the Idea. We talked about his understanding of what is biology, why it needs philosophy, if it has a goal, how it differs from the hard sciences, why evolutionary biology is a useful way to understand the world, if nurture can overcome nature, what he means by knowledge is community-based, and what constitutes bad science. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or the true essence of biology, and its potential to help us understand how life came to be and the various ways in which it evolves with and through humans, as well as all other living beings. What is biology?
Well, there's a straightforward but largely uninformative answer to that. Biology is the study of living things. That doesn't help you much because you need to know what counts as a living thing, and it doesn't tell you about the structure of biology, the biological sciences. A slightly more informative but still largely empty definition is that biology is what biologists do. Along the lines of science is what scientists do. But of course now the problem is to what extent do we allow, for example, a chiropractor to be a biologist, or somebody who disagrees with germ theory, and I do know a few people who disagree with germ theory. So what I'm going to say instead is that biology is largely an administrative unit. And I'll have to tell you a little bit about the history of it to tell you why that is. When the sciences were classified in the 19th century, largely beginning with William Whewell in his 1840s publications, biology had only just been named. Prior to that, there was natural history, which is an older term for what we might think of as sciences related to the earth and the things on the earth, as opposed to natural philosophy, which was the things related to the heavens and the things that were in the heavens. So astronomy and physics and so forth. Alchemy was swapped between the two, really. It was more natural philosophy. So when the term biology was widely applied around about 1800, what happened was that the universities started to set up positions for people to study this new field. There were still departments of zoology and of botany and geology and all those different sorts of fields. Towards the end of the 19th century, especially in Britain, but in European countries generally, universities started to be funded by the state, and there was an increase in the number of people teaching these subjects, and so we needed fields and departments. And if you've got a department, then of course you need to have a department head, you need to have criteria for who gets included and so forth. And so biology was regarded at that point as a science rather than a group of fairly disparate disciplines like comparative anatomy, paleontology, the newly named ecology, which had only just started by that stage. So biology is any or all of those things. It is indeed the study of life, but we still don't have a proper, universally agreed notion of life. We've got biochemistry, organic chemistry, these biological. We've got now the idea of xenobiology, which is potential biological things off the planet Earth. NASA has a program of xenobiology in which they go looking for things that are very much like life on our planet. And of course, it may be that life is something quite distinct on another planet or even out in space. So it's a hard question to answer.
Does biology need philosophy?
Why does biology need philosophy indeed? Philosophy itself is a fairly broad-ranging field. Basically, anything you can think of that humans are wondering about can have a philosophical answer. But there's even more than that. What you'll find is that if philosophers aren't talking about something, a profession, a discipline, a problem, then the people who are talking about the profession, discipline and problem will start doing philosophy. Scientists do philosophy all the time, but to them they don't quite realise what it is that they're doing if they haven't studied philosophy in general or haven't a good idea of what makes up philosophy. I'll very, very quickly give you a summary of how I understand philosophy. Philosophy has three great questions. What exists? How do you know? And what value does it have? Now, these are referred to as either metaphysics or ontology in the first case, epistemology in the second case, how we gain knowledge of the world, and a general field called axiology, which involves anything that has some sort of normativity, is the term we use, such as moral philosophy, ethical philosophy, philosophy of religion, social philosophy, political philosophy, anything really to do with humans and how they see the value of things. In my field, for example, people often talk about we need to conserve species because species are individually works of art or are valuable in themselves, and there are many debates about whether they should have rights, whether they should have legal protection and so on. When philosophers do not engage the scientists, and let's face it, for the last 500 years or so, most of Western philosophy has been responding to the development of science and the problems that arise out of science. And so the fact is that philosophers really depend on there being science in order to approach their problems, because the problems are very often set by the scientists. Now, the fact is, when scientists do philosophy, they're not doing it for philosophy's sake, that is, to answer those three great questions as such. Most of the time when a scientist does philosophy, not always, but most of the time a scientist is attempting to establish the rightness of what they think the science is about, their theoretical view of things, their position within the politics of science, and by politics I mean within science, not whether or not you're a conservative or a nationalist, etc. Although that comes into it. Science is done by human beings, and therefore human beings are going to do these sorts of things. Aristotle famously said humans are a political animal, by which he meant they have social relationships. You cannot ignore this. Science isn't done by, disembodied aliens. It's done by human beings so far. All right. So when scientists do bad philosophy, this is when the philosophers should start to step in. But I do not think that philosophers should tell scientists how to do science. Very largely because we don't know what's going to work either. There are no certainties of intellectual method. And so if a philosopher is telling you what is and is not science, and you're a scientist, feel entirely free to ignore them. In the end, the proof is in the pudding, as the English say.
What are the guidelines that direct the discipline of biology, and are there any guidelines that direct the work of biologists as well?
Yes. Any profession has protocols. Any profession has standards, standard techniques used. Doesn't really matter what you're talking about, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's electronics or whatever. And scientists, and particularly biologists, have a number of standards, protocols, techniques, and so forth. One such standard is the standard of naming and classifying species. Again, this is my question. But that's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. For example, scientists who work on cellular structure are called cytologists, and bacteriologists who work on single-celled organisms, they have techniques like electronic microscopy, like flow cytometry. These are technologies that they use. And interpreting these technologies is always something that you have to be trained into. Every science is an apprenticeship. Nobody just becomes a scientist by reading a bunch of books. There are lab techniques, field techniques, technologies you need to know, conventions on what to publish, where to publish, how to publish. And this is not written down mostly. It's something that you pick up as you go along when you're doing the science. Biologists are also overseen by ethics committees. This is the axiological side of science, in that particularly when you're using human subjects, you've got to make sure that you don't violate the rights of those subjects. And unfortunately, Western medicine has done a fair bit of that on minorities. There's the famous syphilis study of Tuskegee airmen who were all black in America, where they left the syphilis untreated, told them that they were treating it, and let them die of syphilis in order to see how syphilis progressed. Now, that was in the 1940s. That's not too long ago. I was born in the 1950s. So we're not talking older history here. We're not talking back in the 18th century during the colonialist period. We're talking about modern treatments. So there are all sorts of ethical guidelines on how biologists can behave. And this is now extending to questions of whether or not studying Indigenous groups can be done without the consent of the Indigenous groups, or whether they need to be involved, and to what extent the biologists must respect the rights and the cultures and religions and so forth of those who are being studied. In other words, humans are not just objects of study, they're also subjects. And so as subjects, they have a right to have a say in things. And very belatedly, we're starting to see human remains returned to their original custodians from museums. It's taking a while, but we're getting there. So this is a constantly evolving thing, I think.
Does biology have a goal?
If biology is what I say it is, which is a group of disparate administrative units, then no, it doesn't. It's basically just people doing what they're interested in and what they can get funding for, because no scientist these days can study very much without funding. That people are trying to advance their careers, and that's a goal. I mean, you can't be anything as a professional without some sort of income as a result of it. Otherwise, you are an amateur, the literal meaning of which is someone who loves what they are doing and does it for the love of it only, like me in philosophy, because I don't get paid much. But you could say that the sort of abstract goal of doing biology is to understand the living world. That includes us. We are part of the living world and not separate from it. It includes us understanding ecologies and ecosystems, understanding how what we do impacts on the rest of the living world. I believe at the moment the number of mammals individually, not mammal species, but actual mammals, are something like 95% human crop animals, such as sheep, goats, cattle, and 5% wild animals, which is an absurd fraction. We need to know what that means for the survival of the rest of the living world. We need to know what agriculture does to the living world. So these are all goals. Is there a single goal? No, I don't believe so, any more than there's a single method in biology. But this isn't unique to biology. This is true, I think, of all broad sciences like physics, chemistry, and the like. I think, if you like, you can say our goal is to understand the world around us, and I think that drives many biologists to do the work that they do, and that's why they do it.
We often hear of subjects that need philosophy, but are there any conditions under which a philosophy would need a subject?
No philosopher is without a subject. Now, some of these subjects are topics that have been handed on to us from classical philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, but outside the West, the early Vedic cultures and pre-Vedic cultures, cultures in China, basically anywhere there's enough resources for some people to have the leisure to reflect upon complex questions, you will get philosophy. Now, there are, I think, roughly speaking, two poles. At one end, you have philosophers who say that philosophy is effectively the precondition for thinking. It's what makes it possible for us to reflect upon the world. At the other end, you've got people who say philosophy is just reflecting upon problems that come up elsewhere in human life. And I tend to go that end. I tend to think that we get our problem sets from other fields. We get our problem sets from the sciences, we get them from politics, we get them from religion, we get them from ethical questions and so forth. But what we do as philosophers is to reflect much more deeply and broadly the way a professional thinks about any subject. So if you're a businessman, a business person, then you think deeply and broadly about the area in which you are doing business, because if you don't, someone else is going to get to an opportunity before you even know it exists. Philosophy, on the other hand, it's not exactly passive. We do seek out problems, and we do seek out problems in the sciences, but to an extent we're more like somewhere between parasites and commensal organisms. That is, we don't harm our hosts, but occasionally we help them. Most of the time, what we do is not particularly well received or received at all by the people who set the problems, particularly metaphysics. On the other hand, in other fields like moral philosophy and ethics, political ethics, and so forth, that can contribute directly to the functioning of science. Think of conservation science, right? So we need to think about how we are going to act, what we're going to do, whether or not what we do is going to affect negatively on everybody who depends on a region or a resource. That's all philosophy. Conservation biology is constantly talking about philosophical problems, and to a large extent they do appeal to, if not rely on, philosophers who have made it their speciality. For instance, with species, there is a book called An Introduction to Environmental Philosophy by Sandler, I can't remember his first name, which I would strongly recommend anybody working in conservation biology read. It's not only an introduction, but it's actually, it touches on the very deep questions that philosophers are attempting to make sense of.
In what way does biology differ from the hard sciences, especially in terms of what it tells us about who we are and what the world is made of?
Well, that's about 8 to 8,000 questions in one. I'll give a short answer. There was a distinction made in the late 19th century by a German philosopher named Wundt Windelband. And Windelband talked about two types of sciences, the nomothetic and the idiothetic. Now, what that means is he's got a distinction between sciences that are looking for universal laws and sciences which study specifics. It's not unlike the distinction between natural philosophy and natural history. Natural philosophy was seeking universal statements, universal truths that hold true everywhere in the universe. And natural history was looking at what's happening on the planet. Now, mind, at the time they thought our planet was a large part of the universe in European science, or pre-science. But nevertheless, I think the distinction between the social sciences and biology and medicine and what have you on the one hand, and the so-called hard sciences, I don't like that phrase, they're all hard, but physics, molecular biology, molecular chemistry and so forth on the other, is that anything that's true in those sciences is true anywhere in the universe. Anything that's true of the sciences that focus in on things that happen on Earth, that's what happens in a corner of the universe on a Wednesday. It's not universally true. So it may be that there are other things we would want to call living, but if we encountered them, we might not even recognize them as living. There may even be things that we would call living if we could recognize them on Earth. So we philosophers talk instead about the general sciences and the special sciences. and biology is a special science. So famously, the physicist Ernst Rutherford, who was involved in the discovery of and application of radioactivity, he said, in science there is only physics, all else is stamp collecting. I would reply on behalf of the special sciences that a physicist might know how any part of a universe may proceed, but they don't know what's happening until they've done the stamp collecting, right? In other words, you might know how something will orbit a body, but until there's actually a body up there that you can study or that you can at least measure, like a satellite or a moon or something like that, you really don't know what's going on. You only know how, if something were going on, it would happen. And often as not, when physicists have taken Rutherford's view and started to apply their universalities, they find things that don't work. They're called anomalies, something which stands out as not being quite right. And that's how physics, I think, progresses. But yes, in general terms, biology is a special science and physics is a hard science, a universal science.
What is the difference between evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology? Can you please illustrate the difference with some examples?
All right. Evolutionary biology is often thought of being all about natural selection and adaptation. In fact, the majority of evolution occurs more or less by accident. You happen to have a gene handy, you happen to have a river form, there happens to be plate tectonics, which brings the North and South American continents together, and so there's an exchange of flora and fauna and so on. These are all special events, to use the terminology of the last question. Now, if you were interested in how a particular organism plays a particular role in a particular ecosystem or a particular set of ecosystems, like boreal forests up in the north, near the North Pole, or in mountain habitats and so forth, then you need to go in, you need to do the stamp collecting, and you need to then come up with a hypothesis that can be more or less tested. Now, the problem is, nearly all of evolutionary biology, not all, but nearly all, happened in the past. There's stuff happening now. We're seeing that with the pandemic. We're seeing the evolution of the virus to get around the blocks that we have imperfectly put in its way, like masking and so forth. So evolutionary biology is a current thing. And I would just say that there's no point in the history of life on Earth where evolution hasn't occurred. It is occurring right now. It is occurring in multiple ways. It is occurring to human beings just as much as any other organism. Evolutionary psychology, despite the fact that it has the word evolution in it, is very backward looking. In effect, evolutionary psychology works on the assumption that human beings evolved as a species around 250,000 years ago in Africa, and we haven't changed since. That all of the change since then has been social or technological, and that we are, as it were, running, how do they put it, Pleistocene hardware. We're running modern software on Pleistocene hardware, and it doesn't work very well. And I think that's a mistake, largely because I don't think human beings are computers, but more to the point, I don't think that the human brain and nervous system has the kind of rigidity that they're talking about. They tend to be talking about modules and so forth, that there's a modularization of things in the brain. And there certainly is for vision and hearing and taste. There are centers of the brain that process these things. But I don't think so for cognition in general. I think, in fact, the modularity of our social behavior began well before there were humans, when there were primates that started to organize themselves into largish groups, and they needed to organize social dominance, because most primates, and we are primates, are social. In fact, I would say all of them are, if the circumstances permit. All right. Evolutionary psychology also has an adaptive story for each of the so-called modules. And this often ends up being a story about how modern behavior is somehow forced upon us by our genetic inheritance that we acquired when we became human beings 250,000 years ago, or 200,000 or 100,000 or 60,000. I mean, the different people have put different numbers on it. But I think a better way to look at it is that we construct our environments, and we always have. We've used fire for, well, our lineages have used fire for about 2.5 million years. Today, there are foraging societies like the Australian Aborigines in the north of Australia who use fire stick farming to stop undergrowth from making it difficult to find their prey, and in so doing they reduce the intensity of bushfires, which means that trees and other animals and other flora are able to flourish, which is something that I think humans have probably done in most parts of the world, where other animals aren't busy constructing their niches. Elephants, for example, push over trees, particularly in Africa, and as a result they tend to build grasslands, which is called niche construction. That is to say, it's not that there's an ecological niche out there that needs to be filled. It's that we need a certain kind of niche and we make it. So do elephants, and so do birds, so do ants, and it's common. So our cities are in part constructed niches. We have made them because the greater the number of human beings there are, the more specializations and supply chain problems there are, even before the current pandemic. And I think the problem with evolutionary psychology is they want to find something that's adaptive at all points. Now, you see this in the worst of evolutionary psychology. I'm not saying it's all this bad, but where people say women shop because they're foragers, men like to hunt, and therefore they go out to work, and therefore justifying a 1950s American style of suburban atomic families. But when you actually look at the paleoarchaeology and the modern anthropology, you find that this isn't the case. Women can hunt, men can forage. It varies socially and according to local conditions. So there's no necessarily genetic component to that. Another area where evolutionary psychology has really jumped the shark is in the area of rape. There were, in the 90s, a few people arguing that rape is a natural strategy for men to spread their genes. And in fact, there is a sexual strategy that's quite common to human beings, and that is we are nearly monogamous. That if you look at a gorilla, silverback gorilla, who is the alpha in a troop of gorillas, he has a harem of females, and just so long as he's able to defeat other males that are roving around looking for mates, he's dominant. That doesn't happen in human beings. You'll get common chimps who are they play what we would think of as Westminster-style political games in order to allocate who gets to mate. That doesn't happen in humans all the time. It can, but it doesn't always. And then, of course, you've got bonobos, which are sometimes called, I think unfairly, the hippie primate, because, you know, mating and sexual display and sexual activity happens between all ages and genders. Now, one of the things that's worth noting is the difference in sizes of the different apes. A gorilla alpha male is roughly twice the size, body weight, and therefore muscularity of the females. Why? Because he spends his time defending his harem against other males. And so there's selection, probably sexual selection, for a large body size for the males. And this is a big difference. Chimps, I'm vaguely recalling, are, I think the males are around about 40% bigger than in body weight and strength than the females. Bonobos are about 10%. The African great ape with the least amount of this sexual dimorphism, that is, this difference in the weight and sizes and strength and so forth of the sexes, is Homo sapiens. We have about a 5% difference on average between men and women. Now that's an indicator of the fact that we tend to be monogamous, at the very least serial monogamists. We're not perfectly monogamous, but very few pair bonding species, even in birds, are. So I think evolutionary psychology has made a mess of a lot of things by importing social attitudes into its explanations of behaviour. In other words, it assumes the behaviour that they're seeing around them is natural and therefore are looking for adaptive explanations for it. Is the wrong way to do it, I think. However, having said that, our social behaviours rely upon our biology. We're not entirely clear on that, but some of it's got to be like our nearest cousins. That is, it's not that we have harems, because that's a gorilla approach, but that we also seek to improve our social standing and our share. We seek to get good mates and so forth. And there has to be some sort of a biology underlying that. It's not entirely biology. As every geneticist knows, genes are expressed in a very broad norm of reaction, it's called. That is to say, a gene doesn't just give you one outcome, it gives you a distribution of outcomes. When you're dealing with things that are complicated and therefore involve many genes, the thing that makes the outcome is an interaction of many genes giving many distributions in many environments and many cultures. So while I understand why people think evolutionary psychology is a good idea, I think there has to be something of our biology in our social organisation.
In your interview on Science, Technology and Future, you said, quote, evolutionary biology is a very useful way to understand the world, unquote. Could you please tell us what it is that evolutionary biology has been able to help us understand and know of our world and perhaps us as well?
Well, I actually don't recall saying that, but I do believe it. So I see the world through the lens of evolutionary biology for the reason that evolutionary biology is the science of complex systems that change or stay stable, are retarded from change. I'll give you an example of why an evolutionary approach is a good idea. When the COVID virus hit, SARS-2, many people said, oh, well, it's just a matter of getting a herd immunity. These things evolve towards what's called commensuality, or, they evolve to become fellow travelers, but they're not, dangerous and so forth. But in fact, if you look at it through an evolutionary perspective, unless we set up the circumstances where the really nasty, the virulent forms, the virulent variants of that virus are inhibited, they will do better than the ones that are less dangerous. You will not get herd immunity. You will end up with a massive infection and the costs of that. And if it hadn't been for vaccinations, which prevents infections, along with masking and social distancing and basic hygiene of air quality in rooms and so forth. If it hadn't been for all of that, we would have seen something on the order of 20 million people die, over and above those who have died. And any evolutionary biologist would have said, yeah, that's what you can expect. Now, why is this? The thing is that from the virus's perspective, evolutionarily speaking, we are just resources, right? We have cells that they can use to reproduce themselves, and so the ones that are fitter in any given moment are the ones that will out-reproduce the other strains of the virus. Now, if you inhibit the spread of the virus, the strains that kill people rapidly or kill more people will be spread less than those strains which are a milder form of the virus and don't tend to kill their hosts. So vaccination, for example, prevents spread of the viruses because people deal with them more effectively and quicker. Now, if you just go free-for-all, like in Sweden, for example, or a lot of places in America, then what you're doing is you're setting up circumstances where the more aggressive, the more virulent, the more resource-using viruses will succeed over the weaker or less damaging ones. You're basically breeding, selecting very nasty variants, and until people get that, they won't see the need to prevent the spread of this virus. And it's true of every disease that is contagious. If you don't prevent colds or flu or dysentery or diphtheria or malaria or whatever from happening, then more people will get sick, and therefore there will be more versions of that pathogen, whatever it is, out there, and it will become adapted to exploiting its hosts. And if we are the hosts, we will be exploited. Okay, so that's one example. But I got into this without a biological education because I realized that evolutionary biology is the field which has thought and worked through most of these problems, and which gives you a particular perspective. I just changed perspective from humans getting sick to viruses trying to reproduce, right? So that change in perspective gives you a better idea of what's going to happen, right? And consequently, I think that evolution is something that is more or less universal in complex environments. That includes the human social and conceptual environment. But that doesn't mean it's all about natural selection. In fact, a book which effectively kickstarted the modern view of evolution starts out with the sentence, "Natural selection is not evolution." And what does that mean? It means that natural selection can cause change, but it can also inhibit change. And it depends on how well adapted a variant is and what it's competing against. So if, for example, being a philosopher had a genetic foundation and it was less fit at getting resources in the environment, then philosophers would be selected against. And as the resources available to philosophers deplete for various reasons, which can also be given evolutionary explanations, although we call it sociology or history these days, then you will see fewer philosophers. Just take one of the social changes that I think is damaging. So the answer to that is because evolution has worked out the way things proceed in complex situations of change, I always recast things in an evolutionary sense in order to understand how it's happening. But I do not expect that I will be giving you either a selection-based account of anything. Things can happen just because things can happen. And the other thing is that just because something is the case in evolutionary biology, just because there are genes, for example, in evolution, doesn't mean there have to be something called memes or anything of that kind that evolve in the same way. Most of culture is picked up through copying rather than imitating rather than exact copying. Although there are elements. And that's why I think, for example, in biology, you need to do an apprenticeship with a working biologist before you can understand what you're doing.
Well, now I don't know if this is a question to ask a philosopher of biology, but I was wondering if any branch of biology deals with the evolution of memory among humans. And if it is, then would you be in a position to help us understand human memory from the perspective of biology?
Okay, so I can't really tell you very much about this. I have friends who've worked in it. The current thinking I understand, and I am at least 10 or 15 years out of date, is that there are two types of memory, procedural and episodic. Procedural is how you know how to do something, and any animal with a nervous system has ways of dealing with their environment that is procedural. Now, some have that at birth, how to walk. Others, like us, have to learn how to walk. Butterflies know how to fly when they emerge from the chrysalis, from the cocoon. Birds have to learn from the nest, and so on. Procedural memory is, I think, pretty universal. Episodic memory is the really interesting one. Humans remember events, but we don't remember everything about events. What we remember are bits that we use to reconstruct what we think happened in the past. So witnesses often get things very, very wrong. And in courts, when we find that we've got eyewitness testimony and video evidence, we'll often find that people get things quite wrong. Why Did we evolve episodic memory? I suspect it has to do with the fact that we need to keep track of our relationships with other members of our social groups, whether we're baboons or whether we're humans, or for that matter, whether we're cattle. You need to know who is more dominant than you to avoid getting in a fight. You need to know who is less dominant than you in order to get resources from them without a fight. You need to know who you're competing against, etc. Now, we have what's called working memory, where we can track a certain number of these episodes or interactions. And humans have quite a large working memory compared to other primates, but we seem to be able to remember around about 300, 350 plus or minus 100, depending on each person, individuals that we track, so that we know who's going to cheat us, who's going to beat us, who's going to feed us, I guess. But think about those monkeys that live in colonies of 1,000 or 10,000, and now you've got a problem. You can't remember each and every individual. You might remember a few. You might remember your family. You might remember your extended family, but you won't remember every individual in that enlarged troop. Sometimes I think called a band, because there's too many. You just can't do it. So what do? I think evolution's solution to this, and we do this a lot, is to give us surrogate categories. That is to say, he's bigger, I'll leave him alone. His fur raises when he sees me, I'm under threat, and so on. And once you get to the point where a lot of what your episodic memory is about is cultural rather than genetic, then social evolution takes over, and we start to develop things like, like Vana. It's something that we do. We generalize the properties of many, many people on the basis of how they look, how they act, how they speak, how they dress, what they own, and so forth. And of course, in the social sciences, this is called essentialism. This is the idea that there is an essence to being a member of that group. Biologically, I think it's because we're outsourcing our personal interactions to group interactions. And that's because we have a memory limitation. But that's really all I've got to say about memory, I'm afraid. It's really not my field.
Would you be able to tell us what the understanding of evolution looked like in the time of Darwin and what it looks like today?
Oh, good question. Evolution precedes Darwin as an idea. In fact, the reason it's called evolution is because there was an idea somewhere between a century and 50 years before Darwin published, where evolution of species was thought to be like an individual development. That is, there's a youth, there's an adolescent, there's an adult, there's an old age, and that species go through this process. And they do so as a whole. The Latin word for development is evolutio, which means to unroll a scroll. When Darwin came along, he was proposing something kind of different. There was no pre-programmed developmental process or direction that evolution went, nor was there a grand overarching tendency for things to become more complicated, more intelligent, stronger, or any of these things. Darwin actually shifted our view and he called it descent with modification, which is a more neutral way of talking about it. So he introduced what you might think of as what biology does in small areas or large areas at different times and rates and speeds with no overall goal. Now, Darwin's view on evolution was very influential, but it was actually not accepted very widely by biologists for about 50 years after he published it. And once he died, the older view started to come back. It was called neo-Lamarckianism, after Lamarck, who had come up with a very famous version of the developmentalist approach to evolution. When genetics were developed, of course, everybody said, oh, well, that puts pay to Darwin because genes are particles now and inheritance is not gradual, therefore natural selection cannot apply. So while Darwin might have been right that there is evolution, evolution happens stepwise. You might think of it as the evolutionary biology of Marvel's X-Men. Right? There's this sudden leap from this sudden gene change and all that. But some mathematicians pointed out that if many genes contribute to every feature of an organism, then you will get fundamentally, as I said before, distributions of traits and therefore natural selection, as well as drift and accident and a bunch of other things can happen. And so what's basically changed is that as Darwin's views were readopted in the light of this new Mendelian genetics, and as we became more aware of how genes actually worked at the molecular level, we started to discover that in fact even that's not true. Genes are not particles. Base pairs are particles, but genes are things that can be used, not used, dampened down, exaggerated, and there's enormous variation in how a population of any organisms develop out in their environment. We also discovered that the environment is one of the things that makes a gene work or not work. That is to say, I'll give you the classic example. When we discovered that we could milk cattle, human beings whose genes for digesting that milk properly had an advantage over those who didn't have those genes. In other words, the genes were turned off at weaning in most people, but there was some variation. And in some people, those genes actually were around much longer into adulthood, and they obviously would survive on things like cheeses and yogurts and so forth, much easier during hard winters and other times than those who didn't. This resulted in a series of genes that spread from the origins of dairy, basically, in Turkey and places like Kazakhstan and Syria, around about 12,000 years ago. And that spread into Europe, into Africa, and into Asia and subcontinent. And that's the reason why a lot of people in East Asia who don't have these genes suffer from lactose intolerance. Now, that's a very different view of evolution than Darwin held. And in large part, it's because he didn't understand heredity. He had a try at it, but it wasn't correct. And biologists who followed him also didn't understand heredity very well. And they also didn't understand how the environment and the genes interact to give you what's called the phenotype, that is the overarching body and parts of the body, and how well those parts work in an environment. For instance, if pregnant women don't get enough folate, their children will be born with an unclosed neural column in the spine. It's called spina bifida, and those children tend not to live very long, although we've got some ways of treating it now. So you could say that there are certain genes which require folate to develop proper spines, and therefore they are spinal genes, but they're not the only genes. Not only do they work in other parts of the developing fetus, but there are other genes that work in that sense. So we have a very, I really don't know how to say it, multiple notion of genes working together. And as this isn't my area, I'll stop talking now.
Can nurture overcome nature?
It does all the time. Nurture is the social aspect of your upbringing. It includes the food that you get when you're younger. It includes the pollutants that you're exposed to as you're developing. Arguably, the introduction of leaded fuels in America caused the poorest people to have certain deficits that led them to commit more crimes. And as lead has been taken out of paints and fuels and so forth, and people are less exposed to it, crime has actually dropped in the United States. So that's a sense in which nurture overcomes nature. But I think what's meant when people talk about nurture and nature is whether we can train ourselves to behave differently than our genes are making us behave. And again, I think the mistake here is that it's not nature or nurture. Genes set up a range of possible outcomes, and our environment, including our social environment, determines which actual outcome of that range of possible alternatives is the one that an individual will find themselves in. For instance, I was raised in an extremely racist environment. When I was young, we thought anyone not English or Scottish or at the limit Irish was somehow inferior to us. And we used to refer to people by all sorts of nasty names. Now, I try my very best not to do that. In fact, I made a choice to abandon it in my teens because I thought it was morally wrong. There is a sense in which that's nature overcoming nature, because it is natural to take on the values and ideas of your parents and those around you, your authority figures. And it's actually very hard to get away from that influence by the time you're in your late teens. But I was a member of the counterculture, so here was another nurturing influence which changed my ways. So I still fall into bad habits of painting an entire ethnic group as something, but I pull myself up on it. It's a constant interaction between nature and nurture right up until the day you die. So I don't think genes are destiny. I don't think society is destiny. I think it's a complex interaction.
In one of your videos, you said that knowledge is community-based. Can you please explain what that means and why it might be beneficial to look at knowledge that way, and some of the problems that could supposedly arise if we overlook this idea?
All right. There's a very famous paper, or set of papers, about the use of Hindu festivals to regulate the flow of water to farmers in Bali, which was overtaken by Westerners who said they knew better, using fertilizer and so forth, who eventually caused a major collapse of the rice production in Bali. Now, these techniques didn't, the matching of the release of water and who got it based on Hindu festivals, that was not done in order to maximise the water, but had socially evolved to the point there was knowledge about what worked really well in that environment, on that island, with that climate, that the Westerners didn't have. And so eventually they went back to traditional techniques which maximised the production of rice. Now, there's a case where no one really knew all the reasons why the water was distributed and administered the way that it was, because the water falls up in the mountains and then flows down. They had a series of canals and gates and so forth to give water away. It had evolved. There was an implicit knowledge there, a complex, adaptable and effective knowledge that no individual knew. So that's the sense in which I think that it's worth saying knowledge is community-based. Right? No individual biologist knows everything about biology. Can't be done. In fact, no individual biologist knows everything about their own speciality, although some may come close, because there's just too much of it. The knowledge resides in the institutions, in the communities of professionals, and consequently, it takes time to read a journal article. It takes time to read it carefully enough to be able to use it. So even though all this stuff is published, someone's got to read it. And the knowledge, therefore, is in all the institutions that preserve the written word, that distribute them, that give people the time and resources to read the work of those who've gone before. And even then, you're only going to get a small amount of the detail that we know. So you can say, in a sense, science knows things that no scientist knows.
In one of your interviews, you called the work being done on the subject of evolutionary development amateurish and bad science. According to you, what constitutes bad science?
There's a famous legal judgment in America on, of all things, obscenity in pornography. And the judge at the time, this was back in the 1920s, I think, said, I don't know what, because people were saying this is art, it's not obscene. He said, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. There are a lot of evaluative terms that people use that they could not define, and it's very often a fool's errand to try and define them. Science is one of those things. Now, you can look at science in any number of ways. You can look at science as institutions, which is a sociological approach. You can look at it as projects, which is an intellectual approach. You can look at it as internecine politics. You can look at it as the end result, the current state of the literature. You can look at science all kinds of ways. And anyone who's involved in doing science or studying science from a third-party perspective, like philosophers of science tend to, they'll look at things and they'll say, that's just rubbish science, okay? They're doing it wrong. Now, that would be fine, except that you can ask 50 people and get 51 different answers about what's good or bad science. I cannot tell you what bad science is, but I know it when I see it sometimes. When you're at the very cutting edge of a research program, then you don't know which bet's going to pay off. Everyone is making and taking bets about what will work. Think of string theory in physics. And people will dismiss it as bad science, or they'll say it's great science, it just hasn't paid off yet, and there's no principled answer to that. You have no universal scientific method by which you can judge these things. My academic grandfather, that is my supervisor's supervisor, once said that if you need one scientific method that all sciences employ, then that method is anything goes. There are many, many different techniques and methods and procedures and inferential patterns, but none of them are used by all and only the sciences. So I can't really give you a clear answer on what is bad science. But I think there are some standard things that people do which indicate things to be bad science, and one of them is to appeal to the authority of science. If you say that what I'm doing is scientific, right, you've almost disqualified yourself from being a scientist. That's what phrenologists said, that's what chiropractors say, that's what people who opposed evolution said and say, and it even happens in politics. Lenin wrote a book called Scientific Socialism. Now, socialism is a theory, but it's a political theory, not a scientific one, and nearly all of the predictions he and Marx and Engels made turned out not to work, although there's still quite a lot of value in that. Just because people call something a science doesn't mean it is. And oddly enough, this happens a lot in medical circumstances. People claim to be scientific, and yet, as I know from personal experience, they won't, they'll avoid prescribing a better drug, for example, because they had one patient who had a negative reaction to it. Now, if you are scientific, you know this is a populational distribution and that there will be a portion of people who react negatively to any drug, because all of our biological systems are different, nature and nurture. So if you claim to be scientific but you're not aware of basic statistics or basic theory in the field in which you work, then that's bad science. And as a proxy, generally if someone continues to assert their scientific credentials, they're not scientific. And this comes back in a way to the point that knowledge is community-based, because if you're not accepted by your community, the likelihood is you're not doing it right. But not every scientific project, program, or discipline is, I think, ultimately going to turn out to be science. So there's always a little bit of leeway there. All we can do is go with the best we've got.
And here's the last question. There's a science fiction film called The Man from Earth. Allow me to recommend it to you if you haven't seen it. This came out in 2007 and considers the scenario of a man who stopped aging at 35 years and has been alive for 14,000 years since the Cro-Magnon period. He's very intelligent and is currently working as a professor. The story starts with him leaving his job suddenly, and some of his colleagues, experts in the field of anthropology, archaeology, psychology, theology, history, art, and biology, bidding him a warm farewell. In what will be his last time seeing each of them, he decides to tell the truth about himself, and it's during one of those scenes when the character of the anthropologist says, "We think the men of the Upper Paleolithic were as intelligent as we were, they just didn't know as much." And I wondered, first, if it is true that they were as intelligent as we are, and second, if it is true, then are there certain traits, attributes, attitudes, fears, strengths that we continue to carry from our primitive ancestors? And also, what would be a good way to assess the presence of those traits within us? And of course, the usefulness for a common man to have this knowledge.
Well, it's a long question, but yes, I've seen the film. In fact, I read the short story it's based on back in the 1960s. I've been a science fiction fan since I discovered you could read things, sometime about the age of 4 or 5. And the author, Jerome Bixby, is one of the more famous of the golden age of science fiction. So, were humans as intelligent as we are in the Upper Paleocene, in the what we would refer to as the Neolithic or Paleolithic, depending where you're talking? So just a quick recap. Humans have been around, as I've said, for about 220,000, 250,000 years, but looking at the archaeological evidence, they used stone tools of varying degrees of complexity up until a period around about 12,000 years ago, when we started to become agriculturalists. We continued to use stone tools, but as the population increased due to the increased food availability, we started to develop specialities, and one of those was in metalworking. Initially, people started to use things like bronze, brass, copper, tin, and eventually iron. Now, the fact is that if you think the intelligence of people is something that is at least roughly indicated by the brain size of people, then we moderns are less intelligent on an individual basis than our Stone Age ancestors. They had bigger brains. In fact, the Neanderthals, who were another species of Homo, the genus Homo, than us, actually had much bigger brains than we do. Now, what does this mean? Who knows? Maybe they had bigger scent centers in their brain. Maybe they had, the ability to find food more easily than we do because it was a poorer environment. We don't know. I think intelligence is overrated. For a start, I think we hit peak intelligence about the time that the dinosaurs flourished, and it's just been statistical noise ever since, and we happen to be one of the more distant outliers. But intelligence has remained pretty much the same in the animal kingdom since then. However, if I'm right that knowledge is community-based, bigger communities have less need of individual intelligence because there are more people to pass on how to do things. The ability to make fire, for example, how to make spears that work from local materials. Even chimps show the intelligence as a troop or as a group of troops to know to carry certain rocks from certain places so that they can open nuts that are available seasonally. That's using tools. That's using tools in an environmental thing, and it is socially transmitted. And there's lots of examples of that in other animals. So I think the real question is, why is it that human beings in general have almost exactly the same amount of grey matter between here and here? And what does that mean about intelligence? I think that any normally developed human being is as intelligent as any other normally developed human being. But we specialise. I cannot pull down and rebuild a motorbike engine. I have a friend who can, who did in fact do it for me after I blew a cylinder. We count intelligence generally as being academic intelligence or technological intelligence, but I think that's a big mistake. I don't think there are types of intelligence. I think there are different applications of intelligence. It happens that mine is in abstract language and thought. It happens that other people are very intelligent in their use of certain tools like computers or metalworking tools or something like that. And so I don't think that we can say either that we are more or less intelligent as we were in the past. It's just that we have this complex, the most complex system that we know in the universe. There may be others, but we don't know of them yet, between our ears. And we use them. And the environment has the final say on whether that's good or bad. And the environment, I fear, is going to say it's very bad indeed that we used our intelligence to develop fossil fuel reliance and so forth. We're going to see some nasty outcomes of that. But there is no universally agreed measure of intelligence. IQ only measures what mattered to academic Westerners, the ability to read, the ability to make abstract inferences and so forth. And that's not necessarily the best measure of intelligence. People have started to talk about emotional intelligence. I'm not sure that's a thing, but certainly some people have a better handle on reading other people's intent and mind than others. Ever since I was a kid, I thought I was actually a Martian, and I was studying these apes that I happened to find myself among. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I suddenly realised, hey, I'm one of these apes and nobody really understands what's going on. So, I don't think the question is well formed, although I'm not being critical. It's a good film to watch for the ideas, by the way. I didn't really think that the acting was all that great, or the directing, or anything of that kind. But that's often true of science fiction. My favourite science fiction story was a thing called The Sentinel, published by Arthur C. Clarke in 1961 or thereabouts. And I read in a newspaper a couple of years later that a famous film director was making a film of this short story. And of course the filmmaker was Stanley Kubrick, and the film was 2001: A Space Odyssey, which nobody of a younger generation watches anymore because it's too slow. I was enthralled by it from start to finish. And again, that's culture changing. That's not intelligence. It's nobody's stupider because they're looking at iPhones all the time or anything like that. Intelligence is something that is employed in the environment in which you find yourself the best way you can. So I hope that long set of rants has been useful, and that you enjoyed my asseverations. Thank you.
My conversation with Dr. Wilkins helped me see science as a continually evolving process itself, and of evolutionary biology as a useful way of understanding ourselves and how the debate between nature versus nurture can transform into a discussion of nature, nurture, and how they influence each other. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the conversation and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thanks for being here. I will see you soon with another interesting mind demystifying another interesting subject. Until then, take care.